We're just reminiscing. Okay. On it. Oh. All right. Hi, everybody. I guess we're all here, or as many people are here, and they'll get on as we go. So without further ado, I am so pleased to introduce Joshua Henkin. Joshua Henkin is the author of the novel Swimming Across the Hudson, a Los Angeles Times notable book, Matrimony, a New York Times notable book, and The World Without You, winner of the 2012 Edward Lewis Wallen Award for American Jewish Fiction, and a finalist for the 212 National Jewish Book Award. He lives in Brooklyn, New York, and directs the MFA program in fiction writing at Brooklyn College. We are so pleased to hear him and to be in conversation about his book, Morningside Heights. We'd like to start by asking Joshua to read about 10 minutes from his book, pages of his choosing.
Sure. Thank you so much for the lovely introduction. Yeah, and I'll just say a few words about the novel for those of you who haven't yet read it. So the novel covers, actually 4 or 5 decades of a long marriage. And I'd say the protagonist is Prue Steiner, who grows up in the Midwest in an observant Jewish home and goes off to Yale and then starts a PhD program in the 1970s at Columbia in English literature. And she's a very smart and accomplished woman, and she's heading on a career path of her own. And she ends up meeting and falling in love with her Shakespeare professor, Spence Robin, who is a big scholar at Columbia. And they end up getting married, and she basically gives up her career for him and becomes a faculty spouse and raises their daughter together. And then when Spence is in his late 50s, he starts to become forgetful. And he is eventually diagnosed with Alzheimer's, with early onset Alzheimer's. And the book is a lot of things, and it follows a lot of characters, but most fundamentally, it's about what it's like to be Prue, to, essentially be a smart, accomplished woman heading on a career path who, ends on a path she hadn't anticipated, ends up hitching her wagon to a star, and what happens to that wagon when the star fades. And so it's about a lot of other things too, but that's that in a nutshell is what the book's about. And I'm going to read for about 10 minutes for an early section of the book, really when Prue and Spence first meet, so you can get a sense of Prue and get a sense of that developing relationship. And for those of you who have the book and are following along, it's toward the bottom of page 5. Her first day of class, she looked up from her seminar table and saw Spence Robin, her Shakespeare professor, enter the room. He was only 6 years older than she was. He was the professor, Columbia's rising star. So when she passed him on a snowy afternoon outside chock full of nuts, she glanced away. "Are you pretending to be shy, Miss Steiner?" That was how he addressed the class. Miss Steiner, Mr. Jones, Mr. Thompson, Miss Dunleavy, doing it with an edge of humor, as if it were a mild joke. We do spend most of our day outside the classroom. It's not like we just materialize in Philosophy Hall. Turn the page. A gale blew past them, and Spence's jacket collar flapped up to his ears. His shock of auburn hair was covered in snow, and Prue was tempted to offer him her hat, but her hat was pink, and if she gave it to him, then she would get covered in snow, and she knew he wouldn't countenance that. They seated themselves in chock full of nuts. "The coffee's terrible here," Spence said. Prue agreed, though she was inured to terrible coffee. She drank terrible coffee most days, often from chock full of nuts. Spence removed the packet of peanuts, It was an old habit, he explained, a product of his fast metabolism. He'd been so thin as a boy, he'd been sent to summer camp by the Fresh Air Fund, and when he failed to gain more than a few pounds, he got to stay for an extra 2 weeks. The snow was falling harder now. At this rate, they'd be skiing home. Prue said, "Are we going to talk about Coriolanus?" "Do you want to talk about Coriolanus?" "As long as you don't make me recite." It was what Spence did in class, saying that word recite with the same little ironical smile he wore when he called her Miss Steiner. "How about you tell me where you're from?" Under the influence of the coffee and urged on by the wind coming through the open door, Prue started to loosen. She was from the suburbs of Columbus, she said. "Sounds like a tautology to me." She surprised herself by saying, "You little snob." Little? It was true, he must have been 6 feet tall. "And what's in the suburbs of Columbus?" "Oh, just a bunch of complicated Jewish families like mine." Another tautology? "So you know about complicated Jewish families?" "I come from one." This surprised her. With his rangy, slender frame, his pale face and patch of red hair, he put her in mind of the Irish countryside. And Spence, she thought of Spencer Tracy, not to mention his last name, Robin. Well, you could have fooled her. "My Christian name is Shulam," he said. "That doesn't sound very Christian to me." In kindergarten, he said, he changed his name to Spence. At 5, he became an Anglo-Saxon. At 6, a Francophile. "It's the old immigrant story," he said. "I was trying to escape the Lower East Side." "Well, you've done a good job," she said. He was the youngest tenured member of the English department, the author at 30 of an award-winning book, a guest on PBS with Bill Moyers. "You're not still religious, are you?" He laughed. His paternal grandfather had been a rabbi in Lithuania, but his parents' God had been communism. He hadn't even been bar mitzvahed. One Yom Kippur, he'd gone to the Museum of Natural History to stare up at the great blue whale. She told him about growing up Orthodox in the Midwest, how she'd moved to New York to become an actor. "So here I am," she said, as if everything she'd done, leaving Columbus, going to Yale, moving to New York to do theater, was in order to be seated where she was now, having coffee with Spence Robin. "I can never be an actor," he said. "I don't like to perform." "That's not what I heard," she said. His lectures were said to be packed to the rafters. People were up in the nosebleed seats. "Acting is different," he said. "I'm a shy man." Yet here he was talking to her, talking to this stranger. But then he stopped talking and she became shy herself. The snow had tapered off, and with the weather no longer keeping them indoors, she thought she should make her getaway. She got up and he followed her. "That's me," she said in front of her building. "And that's me," he said. Spence pointed up Claremont Avenue. "If I work on my arm, I could throw snowballs at your balcony." "I'd like that," she said. And then, feeling foolish, she wanted him to throw snowballs at her balcony. She rushed inside. She started to run into him everywhere, in front of Dave Shopwell, in front of Woolworth's, in front of the West End bar. "It seems our moons are in alignment." She regarded him mildly. "I didn't realize you had a moon." "I think you're following me," he said. "Well, I think you're following me." She saw him on Broadway riding a moped, and she called out, "Hey you, hey Spence, hey Professor Robin." He pulled over. "The picture becomes clearer," she said. "You're the rock star professor." "Then you really don't know me." "Then why the moped?" "Because it gets me places." She said, "Can I hop on?" He took off his helmet and handed it to her. "Shouldn't the driver wear a helmet?" "In that case, you drive." She'd never ridden a moped before, but if Spence could be reckless, so could she. Through the streets they went, the pavement slick like the back of a seal, the rain puddling in the gutters. She could feel his breath against her neck, his hands on her shoulders, large as lion's paws. They parked in front of her building. He said, "You took those streets like a native." She said, "I've always had a good sense of direction." Wasted on someone who lives in New York. He leaned over and kissed her. He smelled of musk and cinnamon. She cupped her palm behind his neck and felt a line of perspiration delicately as a silkworm. She rested her hand beneath his shoulder blades. She pressed her nose to his cheek. She was neither the most nor the least talkative student in the seminar, but at the next meeting, she couldn't even look up. The class was discussing Cymbeline. Was that why no one else was talking either? Because it was a difficult play? Or had the other girls kissed him too? Did he meet them all chock full of nuts? Did he sit across from them eating peanuts? Maybe she would have to drop the course. It was too bad. She loved Shakespeare. The class ended at 4, and at 3:59, she was already out the door. When she stepped outside of her building the next night, he was standing there beside his moped. Oh, she said, it's you. It's me, he agreed. I was wondering if you forgot about me. Forgot about you? I've been waiting here for the last 2 hours. You didn't tell me you were such a stowaway. You could have rung up. I thought it was better to smoke you out. I was getting ready to drive off. He pointed at the exhaust coming from his tailpipe. She said, do you want to come upstairs? I thought you were leaving. I was just going on an errand. It can wait. Okay, he said, but first let me take you for a spin. This time he drove, and as they sped along the streets, she pressed her nose to his neck, felt the hum of her breath against him. When they got upstairs, she took him to the kitchen. Are you hungry, she said. Would you like some food? She removed leftovers from the fridge and placed them in the oven. He said, I don't want to eat your dinner. There's enough for us both. She put some stew onto his plate and some string beans and rice. You made this whole meal for yourself? She said, a person has to eat. They ate and talked while from outside on Broadway came the whoops of college kids and the pneumatic sigh of a stopping bus. She had a loft bed raised almost to the ceiling. Seeing the ceiling fan swinging languidly on its hinge, Spence said, just don't go bolting up in the middle of the night. You're liable to get decapitated. This time she initiated the kiss. He pulled the chain on the ceiling fan and the clanking stopped. Better? Certainly safer, he said. He'd heard of autoerotic suicide, but this would be something else. They lay together, two halves of a clam. Outside, she could hear a woman singing. I'm knock-kneed, she said, and she knocked her knees against his. She rested her chin on the little triangle of flesh beneath his throat. She could feel his Adam's apple, like a sparrow pulsing. Okay, I'll stop there.
Thank you very much. So I'd like to just quote Julie Oranger in terms of a little something that she said about the book. She said, in the sheer pleasure of reading this novel, of inhabiting its detail-perfect settings, its relentless, accurate portraits of marriagehood and parenthood and siblinghood, we can almost forget that its subject is one of the most painful imaginable, the loss of a self, of a marriage, of a shared life. So my question is, why did you choose such a heavy subject?
It's a good question. You know, it's funny. I mean, it is a heavy subject, but I think if for people who actually read the book, they'll see that, you know, there's definitely sadness in the book, but there's also a lot of humor. It covers many years. You can't write a book that's relentlessly sad. And I believe in modulation, even on the sentence level. You know, you don't want the same sentence cadences all the time. So, so it's a novel that celebrates a lot of happiness and resilience, even as it also chronicles some sadness. In terms of why I chose the subject, I mean, I don't think in terms of subject matter. I feel like I choose my characters and they go through what they go through. And, you know, I leave it up to them. But I mean, you know, the book is based on some of my own experiences. My father, like Spence, was a professor at Columbia, well-known professor. And he, like Spence, also had Alzheimer's, although he got it, fortunately, I mean, if anything about Alzheimer's can be said to be fortunate, he got it fortunately later in life than Spence did. He got it not until his mid to late 80s. But he was still teaching at Columbia at the time, which is a story in its own right. And so the book is inspired by his experience, but in some ways it's really inspired more by my mother's experience, because my mother, when my father was in decline, my mother started to go to, basically a caregivers group at the Jewish Community Center on the Upper West Side of Manhattan. And I was really interested in that because my mother is not a consorting with strangers kind of person. She's not a self-help group kind of person. And so I was interested in, how things had gotten for her, that she thought that she would take comfort in the company of people whom she might not have had much in common with, aside from the fact that they were all caregivers. And so the novel started as a pretty long short story that took place at the JCC on the Upper West Side of Manhattan between Prue and a bunch of characters she meets there. And by the 7th or 8th draft, I realized that was not what I was writing about, and that I was really writing about a long marriage. And so, by the book took me 8 years to write, and I wrote 3,000 pages to get to the final roughly 300. So no, 90% of what I wrote never made it off the cutting room floor. And so no surprise for the writer, no surprise for the reader. And so what I started out writing turned out not to be what the book was about. And so the JCC is entirely gone from the novel. All the characters except for one from the JCC version are gone. The character Walter, who remains a relatively important character in the book, was in the JCC version of the novel, but I found a way to introduce him without the help of the JCC.
Well, thank you. I would like to center and talk about Prue a little bit. In my view, Prue gives up the most: her life, her career, her new friend. She lived in the glow of her famous husband, an acclaimed professor, and then she's left to take care of him.
Right.
She takes in a stepson. Then her daughter leaves to go to medical school. And I wondered, do you consider, or did she consider herself a martyr?
It's so interesting. I mean, I don't think she considers herself a martyr. So much about temperament. And I think if I sat down and talked to her, she might acknowledge that she got a raw deal in some ways. And, I think she'd acknowledge that without resentment. She loved Spence, and I think she made that choice with her eyes open. I think she was a woman of a certain generation, and not every woman of that generation would have made the same choice that she did. But I think if she had been born maybe 30 years later, she probably wouldn't have made that choice. But there are people who are 30 years younger than she is who do make that choice. And, the fiction writer's job is never to pass judgment on their characters. I think of a novel as a mirror, not a judge. My job is to make my characters as complicated and real as possible, and to get them into trouble, because getting characters into trouble is how you discover, what they're made of. Obviously she didn't anticipate that her husband would get Alzheimer's in his late 50s. It's a fairly rare occurrence, but it does happen. And, for all of us, there's so much in our life that takes us by surprise. And this is just a particular surprise that she's taken by. At the same time, I kind of feel like she makes the most of it. I don't want there to be any spoilers for people who haven't read the book, but she handles herself with dignity. And by the end of the book, there's a sense that she's moving on in various ways, and there's a real future for her, both professionally and romantically. And so I see her as someone who, makes the most of a very tough situation.
I see. So you speak about getting your characters into trouble. And there's the stepson, the brilliant but dyslexic boy who feels undervalued. Would that be a fair assessment?
Yes.
Did you add, huh?
That would be a very fair assessment.
Yes. All right. So did you You know, in writing the book, did you kind of add him into the story to create a parallel situation or a parallel story?
I guess the short answer is yes. The longer answer is more complicated. I mean, Flannery O'Connor once said that a fiction writer can't do without a certain measure of stupidity, and I think that that's true. And I think some of us come by it naturally, and others have to cultivate it. So I'm really proceeding, certainly in my initial drafts, I'm proceeding intuitively. And so I kind of have to work backwards and try to figure out, why I did what I did. But I do have some speculations about that. So, I teach graduate students how to write fiction at Brooklyn College. I mean, they're extremely talented. They already know how to write fiction, but I'm helping them get better and harness their talent. So one of the things I tell my grad students is that you should never write a story about a ball rolling downhill, because if you do that, the ball's gonna roll downhill. And I think that one of the challenges of writing about someone with Alzheimer's is that, unfortunately, in terms of the medical prognosis, given where medicine is today with Alzheimer's, it is a case of a ball rolling down a hill. I mean, the specifics vary, but you know what the end point is going to be. And so it was very important to me not to write the book from Spence's perspective. We are some in Spence's perspective when he's lucid, but I very much did not want to ventriloquize what it's like to have Alzheimer's. I want to write the book from the perspective of the people who are lucid and who love and know Spence and who have to make some hard choices in terms of how to deal with him. So I was in various ways trying to find other avenues to complicate the book. And Prue and Spence have a daughter, Sarah. And I'm very interested in Sarah as a character, but she's the kind of kid that you'd expect Prue and Spence to have. She's relatively obedient. She is a very good student. She ends up going off to medical school. She's a success on the terms that Spence values. And so there too, I didn't feel like there was quite enough tension in terms of making that the spine of the book. And so it's something I said to myself, well, what if Spence had a son from a previous marriage? And I thought, nah. But I'm a big believer in not censoring myself too early. And so I decided to try. And I wrote Arlo, who, as you described, is he's brilliant in some ways, certainly, but he's not a good student by conventional standards. He's dyslexic. And he's basically being toted around the country by his hippie mother. She wants to poop in all 50 states. And so Arlo is forced to move around with her. And so in addition to being dyslexic, he just hasn't had much of an education. And at some point when he's 15, he comes for a couple of years to live with Prue and Spence and his half-sister, Sarah. And to say the least, it's a complicated couple of years. And so as soon as I started to write Arlo, he really jumped off the page for me. I mean, in certain ways, he's about the easiest and hardest character. The voice came most easily to me. In that sense, he was the easiest. But he's also a character who disappears for years at a time. But when he's there, he kind of takes over the room. And I needed to find a structure for the book that was able to sort of accommodate and reflect both his appearance and disappearances. But I think the urge to find an Arlo was an urge to complicate the book. And because he and Spence really butt heads. I mean, Spence is a guy who just doesn't understand how someone can't just succeed at school naturally. School comes really naturally to Spence, and it does not come naturally to Arlo. And they're both stubborn and obtuse in their own ways, and so they really lock heads. And then from Prue's perspective, since the book is she's really the protagonist, she's forced to mediate. It's hard to be a step parent, and so she has to to deal with Arlo, and I think she loves Arlo in her own way, even though he's complicated. And she has to deal with the tensions between Sarah and Arlo. So yeah, it's hard being a step parent.
You know, I think you have another interesting and complex relationship in your book, and that is between Ginny, the caretaker, and Prue. And that's a very sort of touchy subject because Prue is extremely dependent on Ginny. Ginny really takes care of the professor, as she calls him, and they get in each other's lives in different ways in a very long-term relationship. But yet you put in there that when Spence dies, Ginny appears at the funeral, and Prue says, "Why are you here?" And I thought that was a little interesting nuance about their relationship and the expectation between them.
Yeah. So yeah, I'll say a bunch of things about that. So yeah, unlike Arlo, that came along, in a later draft, I knew from the start that Ginny would be there. I am very interested in that relationship, in part because I saw what that relationship was like when my father was in decline in the last couple of years of his life. He had full-time care at home. And it's a very complicated relationship. Everyone else in the book, basically, all the important in the book, are family members. And so there's a long history there. Even if you're writing a scene at a particular moment in time, there's a lot of history that's either explicit or at least implicit. But the caregiver relationship is a kind of weird 0 to 60 relationship, where, 1 second the person is a total stranger, and the next person, they're very intimate. Next moment, they're very intimate. And it's also complicated in terms of race and class. Ginny is Jamaican and lives in East New York with she's a single mother. She has a teenage son who's a hemophiliac and whom she wants to go to medical school. And he's only a teenager, but he hopes to go to medical school. So she has her own family and her own aspirations. And I think the temptation, Prue is a good liberal, but I think when you have a situation like she has, you can often act in ways that aren't always entirely appropriate. You can overstep your bounds. The temptation on the part of someone like Prue is to think of Ginny as an auxiliary member of her family. But Ginny is not an auxiliary member of her family. Ginny is an employee. And when an employer thinks that an employee is an auxiliary member of their family, whether consciously or not, it's often licensed to take advantage and to not respect boundaries. And that's a real tension, between Ginny and Prue. Ginny is a proud woman and a very good employee, but she also has her own life. And of course, Prue is really privileged. She's, her husband won a MacArthur. They're not fabulously wealthy, but they have some money, and so she can afford to hire, it's a struggle, but she can afford to hire Ginny to care for Spence, but who's going to care for Ginny when she has Alzheimer's someday, if she does end up with Alzheimer's. So I was really interested in the race and class issues there. But then beyond that, I was interested in that 0 to 60 component, the way that Ginny is a total stranger and then she's instantly and intimate. And Ginny is very protective of Spence. And when she thinks that Prue is up to no good, she tries to protect Spence. There's a scene that's no longer in the book, but the spirit of it is still in the book, and I think it captures the relationship. Is that there's at some point when Spence is pretty far gone, he calls out for help from the bedroom, and Prue comes back to tend to him, and he says, "No, I want Ginny." And well, of course, on some level, that's heartbreaking for Prue, that that her husband wants the caregiver more than he wants her, but it also gives her a breather. In other words, she relies on his preference for Ginny. And I think that's the very complicated position for Prue to be in. I mean, obviously, Spence loves her much more than he loves Ginny. But, late in his disease, there are ways in which Ginny knows Spence better than Prue knows Spence. She even knows things about his body that Prue
Why
doesn't.
why did you cut that out of the book? It seems to me that's a good part
I
to leave
cut it
in.
out of the book, yeah. I cut it out of the book because I couldn't get that. I tried to keep it in. I couldn't get that scene to work in terms of the pacing of the book. And so I felt that the spirit, that line was there in spirit in other ways in the book. With my grad students, I will, after they've been up in workshop, I'll sometimes say to them, I don't feel like you know your characters as well as you should, and I'll ask them a series of questions about their characters. And if they're defensive, as they sometimes are, they'll say, well, I don't know why that has to be in the story. And I'll say, it doesn't have to be in the story, but that the knowledge has to be there, because if it is, then the feeling will seep up into the story. Hemingway had the metaphor of the tip of the iceberg. And what you see on the page is the part of the iceberg that is sticking out of the water. But if you have a fully formed iceberg, then the tip of the iceberg will imply the whole iceberg. And if you don't have a fully formed iceberg, then all you get is the tip. And so I feel like a lot of those erased pages. I mean, this has nothing to do with Ginny, but my very favorite scene in the book is gone from the book. It never made it. It's by far my favorite scene in the book, and I just, for a variety of reasons, it didn't work. So you do kill your darlings, but I feel like those pages that you write that don't go into the book, that knowledge suffuses everything else you write, and so you do have that iceberg beneath the water that's suggesting things.
That's well said. Thank you for that. So I have another question. You tackle, in addition, the whole issue of children being fearful that they will inherit this disease, especially early onset Alzheimer's. And Sarah does seem to be concerned about that.
I think
medical school.
I think Arlo does too in a certain way, and he
Yeah.
just manages it differently. Yeah, Arlo is obsessed with his health.
Yeah. So did you research that? Did you do some research to put that in the book in a certain way, or?
Well, it depends what you mean by that. I mean, in other words, I didn't research the feeling, and certainly I can speak from my own experience that, but I know other people who had similar experiences that, yeah, if you have a parent who has Alzheimer's, it's got to at least cross your mind that it could befall you someday, and that's not a pleasant prospect for sure. In terms of research more generally, it's funny, years ago, I started writing fiction after college, and I was actually heading down a different path, a more traditional academic path. I studied political theory in college, and I was going to get a PhD in political theory. And it's interesting to me looking back, because it's hard for me to imagine that, because I'm such a lazy researcher. And I don't like to do research for my work. I mean, I do some research, but I've seen novels that are over-researched. Even like on the most basic level, like you'll see, like in terms of street names, like it feels a little bit like the novel was written by Google Maps. So I do think it's important to get things right. You don't want to distract the reader and get them. And I've had, every writer has readers writing them, telling them, no, this is a mistake, that's a mistake. Sometimes the readers are wrong, actually, but sometimes they're right. But so for sure you want to get things right. But I try to write as much as I can without research, and then I do the research afterwards, because I want to focus on the fiction and on the feeling. But that's a long-winded way of saying that, because my father had Alzheimer's, I know enough about the experience that I didn't have to research that. And my scientific knowledge is, I certainly am not a doctor, but I would say I have a pretty good layperson's knowledge of, health matters. I do have a friend from college who's a neurologist up at Columbia, and I got in touch with him. There's a drug trial in the book, and I wanted to get details of the drug trial right. And so, I mean, there are a few factual things I needed to make sure to get right. So I had, an hour-long
Okay.
conversation with this friend of mine. But yeah, but there isn't that much research in the book.
I see. Well, we're coming toward the end, and I have one question about the end of your book, and then we'll open it up to the audience. So in the end, and I'm coming back to Prue, in the end, Prue seems as if she's going to get back with Walter, who was this man that she had a brief liaison with and then, stopped in midstream. And it seems as if she has plans to go to law school. And I wonder if you were straining to have some happy endings. I know you, at the beginning, you mentioned you didn't want it to be a rock going down the hill. Was this your effort to kind of be uplifting?
No. In other words, so I mean, I think it's an open question what happens after. I mean, that's the reader's judgment as much as it's mine. Like I only have control of what's in the book, but not what happens afterwards. So yeah, I think it's possible that Prue and Walter will get together, but we don't know. I mean, Prue does plan to go to law school, but where that will lead her, one doesn't know. I certainly have never made an attempt to be uplifting or to be not uplifting. In other words, that is, I mean, a friend of mine in college wrote her psychology thesis on how adults group objects versus how kids group objects. And the adults group the apple with the banana, and kids group the monkey with the banana. And that's a way of saying that kids are more natural storytellers than adults are. And so my goal as a writer is to think like a child again, albeit like a smart, sophisticated child. And so, the review of the book in the New York Times book review talks about this sort of how the role of place in the book and the role of Morningside Heights. And I thought it was a very smart reading of the book, but it was not what I was thinking when I was writing. I think you really have to have blinders on. And so, one of the paradoxes of writing fiction is you try to be broad. If you try to write a novel about dementia or about marriage or about the neighborhood, if you have a broad lens, your book is likely to be dead on arrival because your characters will not feel real. And one of the paradoxes of writing fiction is that the more narrow your gaze, the narrower your gaze, the better, the broader the book will be. Like if you are really true to your characters, then the bigger implications will come in through the back door. And so it's very important. I'm not interested in being uplifting, nor am I interested in being not uplifting. I'm only interested in being true to who my characters are. And so to the extent that one feels that there is potential romantically and professionally for Prue at the end, then to the extent that that's the case, that's only the case because I believe it's an accurate reflection of who and where Prue would be at that point in her life. But I haven't.
Thank you.
Yes, I have.
All right, thank you so much for that answer. And now we would like to open it up to questions from our audience. Debbie?
Yes, so please put your questions into chat. We have a question. Do you have real people in mind when developing characters?
Well, I mean, it depends on the book. As I said before, this book, spans in a lot of ways, not always, but in a lot of ways, resembles my father. Prue, to a somewhat lesser extent, resembles my mother. So I guess in that sense, real people are inspirations for those characters, but I don't have those characters in mind exactly as I'm writing. In other words, there's a certain starting out point, a certain jumping off point. But then once I'm writing, the characters are taking over. And I think, there are risks to writing characters who are based on real people because you have to be willing to have enough distance to make the right aesthetic choices. The first workshop I was in as a student, there was a woman in the class who wrote a story that was, transparently autobiographical about her breakup with her first boyfriend. But the story is actually better than that thumbnail description sounds. And we all told her what we thought was working in the story. And then we all agreed that there was a certain scene that wasn't working. And when it was her turn to talk, she said, well, that scene that you thought wasn't working, it actually happened. And, the proper response to that is a polite, kind version of who cares. That the fiction writer is always trying to get at a deeper kind of truth. And sometimes you have to lie to get at a deeper kind of truth. And so I think there's always a balance between being too close to, too far from actual reality. But in this particular book, there are certain characters, not all characters, but there are certain characters who are inspirations. There's certain people from my life who are inspirations for my characters, but then the book goes in a direction you can't anticipate. So I'm not thinking about people in my life as I'm writing.
Okay, another question. Would you divulge the favorite scene that did not make it into the book?
Sure, yeah. So it's actually complicated because it's not just the scene. I built something, I'll be specific. So in an original early version, and for several drafts of the book, Spence was not a Shakespeare scholar, but he was an art historian. And it just wasn't working. For any number of reasons. One is that I know more about Shakespeare than I know about art history. And so I didn't think I was doing that good a job of making him an art historian, but probably more fundamentally, he just constitutionally, temperamentally, did not seem like an art historian. Spence is an ascetic, and he's someone who only begrudgingly, he's like my father in that sense, he only begrudgingly accepted that he had a body. And while in theory you could have an art historian who is like that, it's not how we think of art historians. We think of art historians as being about physical beauty, about the physical. And I had several early readers say to me, well, I just don't buy that Spence is an art historian. And I knew they were right, but I was resistant for a long time. I eventually took their advice, but I was resistant for a long time to changing him from being an art historian because I had this scene that was really contingent on his being an art historian. So, and the scene is this, and so this is an illustration of how much gets cut in my work. But Prue has a brother, Hank, who's mentioned appears pretty briefly in the book. But in an earlier draft of the book, she had a sister who was actually a pretty major character in the book. That sister is entirely gone, but when that sister was in the book, there is a scene in which Prue and Spence go up to Boston for the sister's daughter's bat mitzvah, Prue's niece's bat mitzvah. And this is at a time where Spence is not doing very well, but he's not yet been diagnosed. Another change that happened in all those 3,000 pages that got thrown out is that in the earlier draft, it just took him much longer to get diagnosed. Whereas in this draft, in the final draft, he's diagnosed much more quickly. So in any case, he's in this version, he's not doing well, but he's not been diagnosed. And Prue kind of has her head in the sand a little bit about what's going on. She's in denial. And so at some point at the bat mitzvah, he disappears, and she can't find him. And she's sort of in a panic. And then all of a sudden she sees him. And what's happening is that there's the proverbial bat mitzvah slideshow. And the father of the bat mitzvah girl, Prue's brother-in-law, is narrating the slideshow. And while the girl is, playing tennis and swimming in the Indian Ocean and snorkeling here and at the Wailing Wall in Jerusalem, as the slides are scrolling by, Spence emerges from the shadows and grabs the pointer from the bat mitzvah girl's father, who's narrating what's happening. And he starts to conduct an art history lecture. And so while all those slides of the bat mitzvah girl are scrolling by, he's talking about chiaroscuro and about Caravaggio, etc. And if I'm allowed to say so, I think it was a great scene. I think it was both funny and sad, and I think it captures something about Alzheimer's for those of you who've seen it up close, which is that from one second to the next, the person can go from coherent to incoherent, or even in a single moment, they're both coherent and incoherent. That's kind of what's, I mean, on its own terms, the lecture that he, delivers kind of on autopilot is brilliant, but it's also utterly incoherent because it's not Caravaggio on the screen. It's his niece by marriage, being a 12, 13-year-old girl, doing things that kids that age are doing. And I just really loved that scene. And I realized that it was in order to save that scene that I insisted on keeping Spence an art historian until I realized that, you know what, he's not an art historian. So I'll have to make him a Shakespeare scholar, which was for the benefit of the book. He's fundamentally a Shakespeare scholar. He's not an art historian. But I had to lose that scene in the process.
Another question, who reduced the 3,000 pages to 300? Is it you, the editor, or others?
Yeah, my editor is great and I love her, but I would never give 3,000 pages to anyone. So I reduced 3,000 pages myself. I did have an early a draft that was 750 pages, which I subjected a couple of writer friends of mine to, which I feel bad about. And I mean, that version was actually on a scene level and a sentence level quite tight, but there were just scenes that felt like set pieces they weren't really contributing to the book. But in general, I mean, I don't show my work to anyone until I've gotten it as far as I possibly can, and I would never drop 3,000 pages on someone's lap. That's kind of unconscionable. And also, there's no point. The writer needs to figure out. I mean, I think you do need help at some point. I trust myself as a critic, but I obviously can't see my work as clearly as I can see the work of others. But I do think it's important for me to get the book as far as I can get it before I show it to people, for their sake, but also for my own. In other words, I need to have a sense of what the book needs to be in order to get the advice that will be most helpful to me.
So I'm just curious if anyone has shown an interest in making this into a film.
So there has been interest, but there's been there's no deal yet. So my last book, The World Without You, was made into a film. I wasn't involved in the making of the film, but I was happy to have it be made into a film, and there are some very good actors in the film. I forgot who said it, that there's a famous quote about a novelist watching their book be made into a film is like someone watching their ox made into bullion. But I don't really feel that way in this. I think that film and fiction are different art forms. There are definitely things that fiction can do well that film doesn't do well, but there are things that film does well that film does better than fiction does. And I think for a fiction writer, what we really want is to have more as many readers as we can for our books. I mean, I've been very fortunate in that regard, but you always want to have more readers, and often a film helps in that regard. So I'd certainly be very open to, under the right circumstances, having it made into film. I think in some ways this book might be better suited for like a TV miniseries. Like, if the person who did Olive Kitteridge wants to do this book, or if the person who did Normal People, those are two. I mean, Olive Kitteridge was a 4-part HBO series, and Normal People was a 13-episode series. But I thought that both those series were really outstanding, and I'd be very happy to have those people turn my book into a series. I have a very good film agent, so hopefully something will come of it. But we'll have to wait and see.
And how has book touring been during the times of COVID?
It's interesting. I mean, it's obviously very different. I mean, this whole relationship to publication was hugely influenced by COVID. So Morningside Heights was supposed to come out in June of 2020. And once COVID hit, my publisher pushed it off a year, which I was very grateful for. I think, I mean, we're still not out of the woods, but June of 2021 was a better time, much better time to have them out than June of 2020. So, so that was weird in its own right. And then, then everything was on Zoom. So I wasn't going on live tour the way I've done for my other books. I miss certain things about live tour, about, being in person and seeing people in bookstores. And, it's nice to be able to go to some places where the cities where I have friends and things like that. But in a lot of ways, I feel like being on Zoom is easy, in some way easier. I mean, first of all, it allows me to talk to you guys, for instance. I can't just, there are limits to how many places I can fly. And so Zoom allows for, I talk to a lot of book groups on Zoom, and those book groups themselves, they're not all in the same place. So, and it's obviously, easier to just sit in your living room as opposed to going to the airport. So, as with all things having to do with remote participation versus live participation, there are positives and negatives. I'm a cup half full kind of guy in general. So I look at it in terms of positives, and I feel like it's been on the whole very good. I mean, there are things I miss about being in person, and I'll be happy. I mean, I was teaching on Zoom for 1.5 years, and now we're back live. And there are challenges to being back live. I mean, we're sitting in a classroom for 4.5 hours with masks on, which isn't so easy. But on balance, I think having live class is better. And my hope is that for my next book tour, I'll be live again. But I've enjoyed being on Zoom as well.
And you're writing your next book already?
I'm trying to.
You're trying to?
Yeah, I'm working on 2 different books. I mean, it's a weird thing because I said before, Morningside Heights was supposed to be published in June of 2020. The book was in galleys. I mean, the book was in bound galleys and done. And then I happened to gotten a teaching leave for a semester in the fall of 2020. So I had this freebie at the time. It's very rare that you actually can start a new book before your book comes out, because even once you're done with the book, you have to do publicity. There's just a lot of stuff. So, but because everything was set to go, and I had this year break, I started, and I got most of a draft of a new novel done, and I also worked on another novel. I mean, they're both a mess. But my hope is that, I think it has to be bad before they're good, and I feel like a book takes as long as it needs to take. But I do think there's reason to hope that these books won't take 8 years. And I'm just a question of figuring out which one that I'm going to finish first. And there are things about each of them that each of them challenge.
We hope that you'll come back with your new book once it's published. We enjoyed having you here and talking about your book, Morningside Heights. Everybody who hasn't read it, go out and get it and read it. I think it will be a very informative and enjoyable read for you. And so thank you so much, Joshua. And I'd like to remind our audience that Hilma Wolitzer is our next author. She has a new book of short stories. Actually, many of them are not new. It's a collection of short stories called Today a Woman Went Mad in the Supermarket. It has an intriguing title, and she always makes us laugh. And she will be on our author site January 11th at 3.
Yeah, so let me just first of all, I want to thank you all, and that's a great book. Hilma's book is a great book. It's a great title, and I think she's a real inspiration. I believe she's 91, 92. She's in her 90s,
Right.
And she's still writing, so that's great. And I also feel really happy to have been introduced to your organization, which I hadn't known about before you guys got in contact with me. It sounds like a great organization. So keep up what you're doing. And as I mentioned before, I talked to a lot of book groups. So if there's any people in book groups who want to discuss Morningside Heights and want me to participate, you can reach me through my website and I'll get that to you. So anyway, so thanks so much for having me today. I really appreciate it.
Great. Thank you very much, Joshua. And thank you, Debbie Honoroff, for being my coordinator for this event.